Hello, you're tuned into the supply side with your host, Tony Paquin. We're here to unravel the medical supply chain's twists and turns one episode at a time. Together with industry insiders and healthcare pros, we'll dig deep, ask tough questions, and maybe, just maybe, find some answers. We're very concerned about the national need to have a solid supply chain, and we're really going to dig into that subject. So let's get started. But first, don't forget to press that subscribe button. Today, in this episode, we're actually going to have with us Anthony Paquin, my Vice President of Supply Chain at iRemedy. And if you caught the coincidence on the name, my son. Anthony's been with us here at iRemedy for about 10 years, and he actually works very, very closely with this supply chain issue, working with manufacturers and suppliers and distributors all over the world. Today, we're going to focus on globalization, which is a real key factor in the medical supply chain. And particularly, we're going to talk about the U.S. dependency on China, drug shortages that we're all experiencing in healthcare today. It's been an ongoing problem, and very interesting stories around Operation Warp Speed. So, Anthony, take a moment and say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. And we could talk for hours and hours about this. It's what we do every day here at iRemedy. At least it's what I do every day. But for the sake of efficiency and your attention, we're going to talk for probably a half hour about our experiences at iRemedy with the globalization of the medical supply chain, the risks associated, the experiences, and all the crazy stuff that goes on when dealing with a global world.
So it's interesting what has happened in the medical supply chain is, similar to that's happened in every product that we use here in this country, whether it be, semiconductors or computers or clothing or automobiles, whatever the case might be. Over the last 20, 30, 40 years, that's all moved overseas. And I experienced this interesting early in life. As a young man, my father was a executive at General Motors at a time when all cars were really made in America. And then, of course, the Japanese and Toyota and Honda became very competitive. And this globalization movement started happening back in the 70s and the 80s. And really, it just took over as our entire economy, virtually all manufacturing, has moved overseas. Now, what's interesting is China did a very good job of taking that over. They're not just cheaper. In many ways, they're better. They just do a very good job. And so they've, as part of a strategy, and now are dominating the global supply chain. And particularly, what we're going to talk about is medical supplies. There is a very interesting book that I would recommend to everybody. I believe it's called The 100-Year Marathon. And it's about a strategy that was established in China about 80 years ago by Chairman Mao. And it was a 100-year plan by the nation of China to become a dominant world force. And they're doing that, not only militarily, but economically, growing their gross domestic product, but also becoming a manufacturing center for the world. We've all seen this. We're all experiencing it. And particularly in the pandemic, we experienced it firsthand. But really, it's just been going on for decades. Now,
Well,
it's
hold
created
on.
a... Go ahead,
It's one
Anthony.
thing, and we've used this line before, but it's one thing if your T-shirt is manufactured overseas, or if your automobile is manufactured overseas. You care, but it doesn't have a direct impact on your health or your how long you live, your longevity, or your family's longevity. You could sort of write those things off as I'm getting a good product for a cheaper price. But when it comes to life-saving medicines and all of the other supplies, the thousands of other supplies, globalizing those products have a different risk associated with them.
Yeah, we talk about, what's in your medicine cabinet and where did it come from? And and if you think of the average person, of course, blood pressure medications and cholesterol medications, think much more serious things like cancer drugs or blood thinners, anti-stroke type medications, and even common over-the-counter drugs like Advil or Tylenol, acetaminophen, other drugs like that. It's turned out that they're virtually all made in China. I mean, by that I'd say 80%. And by the way, not only drugs, devices, medical supplies, the whole range of things that we use every day in healthcare are now made in China as part of a strategy. It's a very interesting change in our world order that we weren't really expecting when this kind of globalization movement took place. So,
Yeah, and a lot of politicians, of course, over the years, and me being a young 32-year-old, I don't have as much experience in watching the politicians try and get elected, but they all talk about America used to be a place where things were made. And again, to reiterate, it really matters if it's something that is going to give life or save lives. We could all get behind a cheaper car, a cheaper T-shirt, or wherever the case is, but we don't want to cut costs, or we don't want the cheapest product if it's going to give somebody that we love more years on their life. And unfortunately, this has been a strategy from China from very early on. Tony alluded to it a second ago in that book, 100-Year Marathon, and it's something that we have to actively combat. The the jack is out of the box, right? Or Pandora's box. It's hard to put it back in, but we could take steps in changing how we currently procure supplies, and we could incentivize the reshoring of medical manufacturing in America. We have to. It's not if, but it's when.
yeah, what's interesting is that the industry involved in such a way, healthcare that is, that healthcare providers, doctors in hospitals, let's say, medical clinics, surgery centers, dental, I mean, the whole, gamut of everything that you use in healthcare, they don't really maintain inventory of products. I mean, the entire system is built on this concept of like just in time inventory. That's the remarkable thing. So that hospital or that pharmacy, they're not sitting there with 6 month supplies of, a 6 month inventory of the supplies they need. That's not the way it's set up. They have a very reliable system, frankly, that when it works. But that reliable system is dependent upon foreign entities. Now, it happens to be mostly China, but it could just as easily be Malaysia or India or other countries. But what happens is the hospital gets supplied by a distributor. The distributor receives products, being delivered over the ocean. The products in the ocean are coming from warehouses in China. The warehouses in China are getting products from factories inland China. And then they are getting raw materials to make those products from either other places in China or other places around the world. And that kind of very simply stated is the supply chain. But nowhere really in that system does somebody go, okay, I got a year's worth of critical, drugs on hand or 6 months of drugs on hand or something like that. It just doesn't exist. And the reason is, it's expensive. It takes warehousing space. It takes inventory cost. I mean, there's a lot of costs associated with that. So naturally, industry tried to avoid that and did avoid it. I have a friend who was head of emergency supply at a very major New York hospital, whose name you would recognize. And during the pandemic, he's a younger guy, let's say, Anthony, your generation, let's describe it as more or less. But he's still a pretty senior executive at this hospital. And he said to me, he says, oh my gosh, we had this crisis, when the pandemic hit. And, effectively, we went to the supply closet to see what we had on hand, talking about a major New York hospital here. He said, and what I discovered was we didn't have a supply closet. There really was no backstop. That's what happened.
And
And when those shipments
it's
stopped,
easy to make light of it now. right? And
Yeah.
we're able to sit here in hindsight 2020 and make light of it and at times almost joke about it. But I remember that phone call, and that phone call was very serious. And he was, even though the head of emergency supply, he was panicking. I mean, there's
It
just no other way to put it. This was March 2020 and in New York City, and he didn't know what to do. And then, of course, 6 months goes by and they have 5 warehouses, but those warehouses in the city are no longer storing product. They were given back to the donors who donated them during the pandemic. So they're
yeah.
back to systems as usual.
They're
And,
back to the just-in-time system of relying upon this supply chain that we've talked about. Yeah, he was panicked, and it's very interesting because in healthcare, candidly, it's a life and death industry. Like you're used to this happening. I don't want to be like cold hearted, but you know, people get sick and die in healthcare. That's the way it is. So when you run a hospital, unfortunately, you deal with tragedy just all day, every day. It's the business that you're in. The ER is full of, tragic things, gunshot wounds and people dying and heart attacks and people having cancer. I mean, it's a rough industry. And you're trained to not get very emotional because if you did react emotionally, you wouldn't react effectively. And that's why they train doctors and other healthcare professionals to manage that emotional response. But in this case, what we witnessed was just true shock and panic. Like
well, it's
it
because
was,
they're trained to effectively respond to it. They're trained to effectively manage death. But when they don't have, that's when they have the resources. That was the key difference. He didn't
yeah,
have the resources to effectively manage the crisis at hand. The crutches were kicked out from under him, kind of thing. And of course, everybody stepped up. We stepped up. A lot of people stepped up during the pandemic and solved it. But we're a society with amnesia to an extent, and everybody's going to go back to their ways, the easy way, the most familiar way of procuring supplies because it's what they're used to. It's what we have available to us in the U.S. Really are no other options, and of course, let's not forget the bottom line. Everybody's bottom line driven. And if they could procure it and shave off a point or two, at the end of the year, well, then that's what they're going to do because they hope not to get into another pandemic situation.
yeah, it is amazing the amnesia thing. I mean, we forget just how the tragedy of what we all lived through. What, just a year, 2 years ago? I mean, pretty recent, right? And there is absolutely no reason why it won't happen again. In fact, really, the expectation is that it will happen again. That we will see these type of pandemics and viruses and so forth. I mean, there's just reasons why we do expect that to occur. Yet so far the system hasn't changed. Now, yeah, the government's aware and we're seeing some things, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's still a massive problem. And to go back to, just to be clear, you know, we are talking. You could say virtually every drug. I mean, there's obviously exceptions of some things that are made in the United States, but really, I don't know, 80, 90% of all drugs of importance are majority made somewhere else and majority made probably in China. They're the by far dominant provider of every major drug and device. Now we could get in a debate and somebody could call me out and go, "Oh, here's a drug, made in Atlanta or something." Okay, great. Out of 50,000, you could come up with a handful. But as an industry, to be clear, 80% of what we need to live urgently is in China. And
Yeah,
I'm talking
the
about,
volume. It's the
yeah,
volume thing, right? There's manufacturing here in the U.S. and it could be a very specialized manufacturer of a biotech or some unique drug or biologic. But there are regular manufacturers here who produce generic pharmaceuticals or produce acetaminophen, but it's not at the volume that we consume. And so that's where the challenge lies: is the volume that acetaminophen kind of thing or a very complicated biologic or cancer drug, the volume is what we lack. not the expertise. We develop these drugs here. We produce a small volume of these drugs here, but it's not enough to sustain the population's consumption, and it's not enough to handle a global event or even a localized epidemic.
Yeah, it's amazing. Really, we have a friend. I know, Anthony, you know who I'm talking about, who is senior executive with a major biotech company, and he's passionate about reshoring or redomesticating the medical supply manufacturing industry. But even his firm, and he would be a leader in this movement, but even his pharmaceutical company can only manufacture their product in China because of the sophistication required, because it's a very state of the art, sophisticated, biologic product line. He said the only factory in the world that has that sophistication is in China. So
Yeah.
even a guy who is working with the government, is connected up and is committed, understands this problem, is personal and passionate about it. Even that company is having to get manufactured in China because they can't. There's nobody in the United States that can make their product. That's the reality of the situation.
Yeah, we'll talk
Remarkable.
about it when we discuss some of our experience with China with Operation Warp Speed and our project there. But there are some other factors in China that allow them to do this, and we'll never be able to compete with those things because it's not in our ethics, it's not in our morals here in the U.S. And so there's that caveat as well. And so you're up against a giant when it comes to manufacturing, and you're also up against a government who is okay with intellectual property theft. Develop it here, manufacture it over there, and all of a
Yep.
sudden you get blocked out of the market in the U.S.
Intellectual property theft, slave labor, lack of regulation and supervision. Three big
Okay. Yeah.
competitive advantages.
I was going to
That's
wait, but if you want to talk about that for a second, I was going to wait till we got on to some of the OWS stuff. But a perfect example, and I'll let you riff on this a little bit, is when we were doing COVID test kits for the government. We supplied, I believe it was over 5 million COVID test kits when President Biden came out and wanted to give them away for free to everybody. And even though these companies have a U.S. entity, they're a U.S. company. It's basically a WeWork office with a mailing address, and everybody who works for the company is in China. They got one person here. And we
absolutely.
were talking with these factories. I know you remember this. We were on a Zoom call with these factories. They have a group of 5 Chinese businessmen and one interpreter. And they say, yeah, we could ramp up production. We could get 20,000 employees in our factory tomorrow. It's like, oh, how do you ramp up 20,000 employees overnight?
Yeah.
Well,
Right. The answer is slave labor because we knew where those factories were located, and it was in a region where they have these camps, and that's what they do. And to your point, what happened there was we tracked that corporate history. We went and looked at those companies, and when you went through the holding companies of who owned them, we ended up identifying one of the companies had already been accused of using this slave labor, and we turned around and walked away from that supplier and that deal as a result of that. But yeah, that's the reality. The other thing that I think is interesting about, you mentioned OWS, and we'll get into that, but just one aspect of it, we were involved in a deal. We'll talk about it a little bit. The government called us up during the pandemic period, and they wanted like 100 million needles. It was really kind of an aha moment because, we're medical supply people and have been for a decade. And, during that era, like everybody, every Tom, Dick, and Harry, as they say, became a medical supplier, used to manufacture toys. Now they manufacture gloves type of thing. So the government calls us up and they want 100 million needles. And we're like, oh, gosh, we hadn't thought about that. That makes sense. Somebody's got to come up with these needles. And what was interesting, so we did that. We ended up, of course, becoming the largest supplier, like in the history of the world, of that product. But they said, and we need them to be made in America. Okay. Now, that, of course, is impossible. But what the simple reason I would bring that up is it shows you how they just didn't even know that. Like, and I think that's, you know, sort of like common. I don't think the average person, really is aware of the extent of this dependency that we have on this foreign power. And we'll talk more about it in a few minutes, but
Well,
and
that's
how
the
that dependency was used against us during that period.
and that's the that's the main point of this is there's a real life impact on the supply chain. So, everybody, in that conversation in the requirements of being made in America, there was another conversation we had with the National Security Council where they were focused on reshoring all of the medical manufacturing and into America. And people are so disconnected with the real life impact of how fragile the supply chain is. Again, society with amnesia, everybody was hyper aware of it when they couldn't get a mask, they couldn't get toilet paper, and they couldn't get COVID tests. But now people are on to the next big thing, the next thing to focus on. And there really is a, uh, a personal impact of the supply chain, 1 degree of separation from everybody in the country, if not yourself. It goes back to what is in your medicine supply cabinet, and how fragile is that supply chain. And we're seeing this all day long, and that is why the FDA has had a shortage list for many years. FDA, federal or Food and Drug Administration of the federal government, they maintain a drug shortage list and have for probably over 10 years. Right now, as of today, there's 181 products on the FDA drug shortage list.
Yeah,
181, and they
yeah,
range. They range, but there's a shortage list, and it's just standard. Standard operations, business as usual.
yeah. I was going to bring up to that end um, a an article because I think that's the remarkable thing is most people don't really make the connection to the fact that we're dealing with shortages today. And and the idea of medical supply shortages is not something new. Like we all experienced it in the pandemic. You couldn't get toilet paper, you couldn't get gloves. But we've really for decades have had ongoing shortages. And I know, Anthony, you pulled this article, up I don't know, an hour ago type of thing, but that shows you how common this is, and to the point you were just making, how this directly connects uh, you know, all of us to this problem of shortages, you know.
Yeah, yeah. If you scroll down, there's some good statistics there. Scary statistics, unfortunately. All of this topic, um, it's easy to disconnect from, because the risk is so grave and the numbers are so big that it's easy to just write it off in your mind, and you forget the real world impact, the on the ground impact of, hey, what if my mom, who is surviving cancer, has this with this special drug, can't get that drug? So you're telling me because of the various reasons, the countless reasons, she can't get her drug because we manufacture it overseas, and there's a drought in the Suez Canal, or I forget which canal is there's like 180 ships who have shored in that
I think
canal
it's
right
the
now.
Panama Canal.
Yeah,
There's a backup of, yeah, because that's very interesting situation is first off, the cancer drug shortage right now is like full on crises. Like this is just horrific. I mean, if you imagine you've got cancer and then what a horrible thing. And by the way, yeah, I'm a cancer survivor, as is my wife. Okay. And so what a horrible, high stress, terrible thing to be going through. Now you end up, you're in, you got a great doctor, you got great treatment going, there's hope, you're being treated, you've got the state of the art drug to address your problem. The drug's not available. And that like is serious. And that's happening right now. It happens. It's a common problem. And it has to do with this complex supply chain. Yeah, there's uh, problems maybe politically, which we're concerned about, national security issues. But just aside from that, just the complexity of getting raw materials in one country, shipping them to another country, manufacturing in that country, dealing with the regulatory issues, and then moving them to a warehouse and dealing with strikes and pandemics and problems with truckers driving across China, and then finally getting them on a boat going for 3 weeks across an ocean and then ending up now there's the problem in the Panama Canal, and and by the way, war in Ukraine, right? And now when you get to the United States, we've got port problems. We can't even unload the ships when they get here, on top of
Yeah.
everything else. You know,
Yeah, so exactly, and it's the vulnerabilities of the supply chain. So the supply chain exists; it is what it is. It's extensive and it goes uh, very high, all the way up the chain to the raw materials manufacturers, and all the way down to the consumer, whoever that may be. But because of it, how big that supply chain is, well, one thing, that product that you're using in the hospital, if you're a provider or maybe if you're taking a drug, that might be a year old by the time you get it because it takes a month and a half to get it across the ocean, let alone everything else up the chain. But separate from that, there are all these vulnerabilities at every step of the way. So even if it's a perfect, well oiled machine where there's truly nothing in shortage, hey, if the Panama Canal doesn't have enough water in it, then you might not get your drugs. So there's too many X factors and too many vulnerabilities that could take place beyond any political or global circumstances that affect a supply chain that's so vast.
yeah. I just highlighted part of this article that says more than half of the hospitals said they're having a hard time finding chemotherapy treatments. I mean, really, seriously? We've invested like $100 million to, get some drug through the FDA. Some factory went through the process of getting it built. We went all the way through, clinical trials and trained the providers. And now you've got this cancer and you work your way through this critical problem. And, and now there's a solution potentially that can help you and save your life or extend your life. And you can't get it because there's like a supply chain problem. I mean, just how absurd is that? It makes absolutely no sense. But it is a daily, reality, even in the good times. That's kind of the point. We're this is as good as it gets. We're in the good times right now. No global war, no global pandemic, no embargoes, no union problems, no strikes. Like this is as good as it gets, and this is what we're dealing with on a regular basis. So it and it really tracks back to the globalization of the supply chain because you can't get it locally. We have a company, Anthony, we're super excited about that's a glove manufacturer. Now, there's a lot of people that are going to build glove factories in the United States because they saw the crises during the pandemic and they're all trying to get into that business. And many of them may not do well because they're not really you know, ready to take on the healthcare industry and all the other things that are going on with this sort of monopolistic system that's out there. But others will do very well, and we have a company that we like a lot that we're starting to work with. And I don't want to quote their name and say it wrong, but
It's
you
American Nitrile,
American Nitrile.
based out of Ohio.
Yep, they have like 1,000 foot long, manufacturing line of gloves. They've got some patents. It's very innovative, really cool stuff. They're doing very well. But what I like about them that they talk about when a hospital makes a commitment to buy gloves from the traditional global system, they're just buying, hope that it's available on some shelf somewhere when they need it.
Buying, buying a
Yeah.
promise.
They're buying a promise. Whereas with these guys, what you're doing when you buy from them, you're buying manufacturing capacity in Ohio. So they can make a glove, put it on a truck, and deliver it to, Denver, probably in what, a day, easily, right, by truck. Whereas, they were, the average glove made in China, by the time it actually gets to the hospital or healthcare provider in the United States, it's probably in the ballpark of a year old. It's certainly more than 6 months by the time it goes all the way through that process. So, there are examples where we're beginning to see this domestication of the supply chain. But we use 100,000 products. The catalog at iRemedy has about 500,000 SKUs in it, and I don't know what's made in America out of that catalog. We talk about this. This is something we're very focused on, but it's, yeah, less than 1,000 or 5,000 products. Yeah,
It's less than 100.
less than 100.
Yeah.
So we got 99.99% of the way to go yet. Right. And
Well,
by the way,
go ahead.
the easy products are the ones that we're currently
Correct.
making, like gloves.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. The easy, cheap ones. So that way we can
Right.
be cost effective. But
Yeah.
we were talking about this whole complicated, long supply chain, and with healthcare, not only do you have the outside vulnerabilities of war and the weather or whatever the case is, but you have a system here in the US that's an allocation based system. It's a what did you buy last year system. And that promise that Tony referenced that you are buying is based on what they promised you the year before. And so if you expand your hospital, if you expand your surgery center, if a pandemic happens, or if you want to, whatever the case is, flu season, well, sorry, we promised you what you bought last year. That is the current state of uh, allocation based system here in the US. And so that in itself is another vulnerability of the supply chain because it doesn't have any room to absorb changes
Yeah.
in demand.
Right. It is. It's a nuance, kind of a complicated issue, but it's a key part of the problem, right? Because there's no reaction time. So what happens is, as you described, if I used 1,000 scalpels last year in my surgery center in August of 2022, then the supplier is allocating me 1,000 scalpels for August of 2023. And you go, well, why would that be? Well, when you think about it, because it goes all the way back to the
It makes
factory,
sense. It makes
right?
sense.
Yeah. And then it
They
goes all the way to the raw material.
yeah,
Like, so it's all
yeah,
been planned out 6 months in advance. So when you call them up and go, oh, no, I need 200, they're like, those cards are dealt. There's nothing we can do. And
yeah.
we refer to that as the allocation system. And all of healthcare in the United States is based on that. The current supply chain is completely based on that concept, whether you're a doctor or a hospital or a surgery center. In other words, whether you're big or small, it's based on this allocation system because it's how the old distributors, frankly, have managed, you know, demand and kind of logistics. That's how they've managed, factory output, raw material input, and then ships and trucks and warehouses, but
And
keeping it minimal. Like they don't want to have a lot of extra on hand. That's not profitable. So they keep it really, really thin. As
especially with one key thing, this inventory expires. It's a medical supply, a pharmaceutical, a scalpel, whatever the case is. Every medical item has an expiration date. So you have that looming danger on your finances, right? If you're keeping inventory, it's not like a semiconductor or a bottle of water, wherever the case is. You can't really keep inventory that long of these types of items. And so this allocation based system, this usage system or utilization system that we're seeing on the provider level, it goes all the way up the chain. And so if there's any, kink or any, vulnerability that affects any step of the way back up to the raw materials producers, well, then you're not going to get those products.
Yeah, so we had an experience that we actually have written a book about this, and he'll be coming out very soon. We're really in the final draft now, being edited, and I think we'll be with a publisher. I would hope next month or something, but really, really soon. Been working on it for a year, but it's on our experience with Operation Warp Speed. Now, again, we've been at this for 10 years, kind of time frame more or less. The government did call us, and we were already selling, like everybody else, gloves and masks and regular supplies, like we do every day, right? But the government called us and wanted needles for the vaccination program for Operation Warp Speed, and we immediately realized, oh gosh, that's a big thing. Like you got to have that in order to give the vaccine. You can't give it without a needle, and we're going to need a whole lot of them because you're going to vaccine kind of like everybody wants it, and you're going to need a couple extra needles for everybody. Like, oh my gosh, this is a lot.
Yeah.
And we knew right away that You couldn't get them in the United States. So the way our technology works, iRemedy is kind of like an Amazon of the healthcare industry, but we have an artificial intelligence based system that works on, we refer to as a smart catalog. Like our tagline is smart supply saves lives, because our software, our technology learns the supply chain automatically and then has answers to questions like this when they come up. The government's like, yeah, we want 100 million needles. Yeah, you're not going to get them in America. We're going to have to go to China. And we did. And that's where we began to really see all these things that we're talking about play out kind of like on one product or two, because it was needles and syringes, but super life critical products, right? And you could observe everything that we're talking about right now. You could see it happening before our eyes.
There
And
was
by the
a
way, that
very
order, go ahead.
well, there's a very finite supply. I just want to add that before you start getting into some of the details, because in the pandemic we saw countless factories pop up. And they may have been a brewery who started doing hand sanitizer, or a clothing manufacturer who started doing masks or gowns. That's all great, but that's not a medical device that penetrates the skin. And so there's a very finite supply of manufacturers who have the proper certifications and processes in place to manufacture a sterile medical device with raw materials from, probably Russia, that penetrates the skin. And I had to kind of interject with that, because it wasn't like the other items that we experienced during the pandemic. The other items sort of self-corrected through capitalism and people being opportunistic. The medical device space is even more of a finite supply than what we were already dealing with.
Yeah, exactly. There was no elasticity in the system. You couldn't just throw together another factory. Although we did see some, China-based organizations do that in a way that was probably not appropriate. But for
But
the
they weren't
most
starting a
part,
new factory. Those other organizations were already
yeah,
producing, but with different certification levels. Like
right,
they only were supposed to produce for the European market, so they only had the CE certification. And then
yeah.
their sister factory had the FDA certification, and they shared it.
Yeah, that's like the absurdity of that. Of course, would never happen in Ohio, but it happens in Shanghai. But yeah, so that's correct. Is that there was like this fixed capacity problem. So and then in the end, all the other suppliers failed. I mean, there maybe one or two of small ones survived, but we were the only one, and we ended up delivering 500 million needles and syringes. So about 1.2 billion items. It was just beyond imagination, the size and the scope of that. And doing it in the middle of a pandemic when everybody all over the world is A, not at work, and B, got one version of COVID or another, right? It was just crises. So some of the things that we observed, just kind of starting with, was this raw material problem. I mean, you start with, okay, great, we got the factories. Oh, they don't have the raw materials they need to make the stuff. So, right, like before we even got started, we had like a crisis of way up the supply chain on the raw material side.
Price
And
gouging the raw materials side, the elasticity of the raw materials. They were focused on buying all that we would need because they knew that they were going to get a price increase. And that happened
yeah,
every step of the way.
yeah, was that like the plastics or something for the
Yeah, the little
syringes? Yeah,
the pellets. Yeah, the pellets used for the
yeah.
syringes.
I remember they sent us a photo. It was like a football field, filled with pellets kind of thing. It
It's
was
as
a
far
lot.
as you could see in the video. Yeah, it was literally a football field of pallets of basically
Yeah,
plastic pellets.
right. That's when the extortion began, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting, in the end, we were told that one out of two Americans who wanted the shot got the shot on a needle and syringe that we supplied, which is a way of saying if we hadn't done that, one out of two Americans who wanted the shot wouldn't have been able to get the shot. And so it shows you that dependency on this foreign power and these network of factories and brokers, and then up from them, this supply chain.
Well, we felt a lot
And
of pain when things would shut down in China, like the factory had to shut down because there was an outbreak. Or let's say when the Shanghai airport shut down because there was a lockdown for I think somebody at the airport got COVID. They locked down the airport. Um, generally speaking, it was dependent upon the circumstance in that things would just happen left and right. Truck drivers wouldn't be able to cross the border of the province because they would need a COVID test. And then we had all these external factors taking place. So we got a glimpse of what could happen if China were just to block export, right? We
yeah,
saw a little hint of that, but it wasn't outright nefarious. But what if China would have blocked export of all of the needles and syringes we need? No, arguably, little vaccinations would have occurred.
yeah. So first off, let's just comment that when China shuts down something, okay,
They shut
they
down.
really shut it down. Like this isn't like, hey, don't come into work today.
No,
It's
they
like come
knock at
into
your
work
door.
today. Yeah,
They knock at your
right.
door to make sure you're quarantining.
Right.
Unfortunately,
Yeah. And they're tracking you with cell phones and like there was 100% compliance. And they'd have one person get sick, they would shut down a facility with 1,000 people. Like that was extreme. Now, to your point though, there was a case where that happened. And that was when the Chinese Communist Party came in and took 40% of our manufactured inventory at several of our largest factories, and particularly our largest factory. They
yeah,
just announced, yeah, hey, we need this stuff locally. We're not going to ship it to America. We need it. And they just
yeah.
took
This
it.
was early on. This was early on in the process. It was after the lunar holiday in China, which is also again another way that they force compliance. They force them to go on holiday. There is no option. And the chairman actually kind of warned us. He said, "Hey, this may happen, and you may want a contingency plan." And sure enough, it did happen. They took 40% of our finished good inventory and also 40% of the production capabilities going forward. And so at that point, we had to come up with a plan and spread the production elsewhere to other factories. But when you're dealing with the U.S. government and you're in a contract with them, you can't just go, "Hey, I got a new product for you," or "Hey, the price is different," because that's what we experienced. We had to absorb that increased cost when we went to the new factories because of that problem, and they knew that they had the upper hand at that point.
Yeah. Something that we touch on in the book that I think is fascinating that again you don't really, think about naturally, but it makes a lot of sense when you talk about it. That is when we manufacture something in the world for use in the United States as a drug, right? It's it's certified, let's say, by the FDA, right? You can't just go make a drug, obviously. You can't go make a drug. You can't go make a scalpel. You can even gloves and masks. They have to be manufactured to a very specific standard. The quality control of that is essential and then that and there's a certification process where a factory is certified, and then the FDA is supposed to supervise and inspect those factories in that process. That's how the system was designed. Now, originally, the system was designed for domestic manufacturing capability. So, you like our glove guy in Ohio, the FDA probably sends inspectors over there unannounced, making a surprise visit. It's just like if you're a drug distributor in the United States, the DEA will just show up. They're not going to call and say, "Hey, at 2 o'clock on Tuesday, we're coming by." They
Or
just
it's like
show up,
it's like OSHA at a construction site coming in to
right?
make sure you're not
Yeah,
standing on a
we'll give
ladder.
you a week's notice to get everything squared away before we get there, right? So that's how this system is designed. Well, so let's talk about the FDA. Let's be real. The FDA, first off, even going back to when times are good, they don't got people, enough staff, enough people to supervise China. Okay, come on, that's absurd. And by the way, even if they did, you don't do surprise visits in China. You don't surprise anybody with anything in China. That's not how their society works.
Yeah,
Okay. And so, but during COVID, they were in total lockdown anyhow. You could, didn't matter who you weren't cruising around China. That was, we tried to go because here we are, we're in the middle of this life and death situation, and we had the cooperation of the State Department and the military and the Pentagon, and we were very involved, talking to them all day, every day, and they were very supportive in working with us. And we were going to fly over there on one of the jets. We ended up chartering about 130 747s, just so that we could personally see what the heck was going on. And China was like, yeah, no, you can come. First they said no, and then they said yes. But then it was, yes, you can come, but you're going to get locked in a hotel for 2 weeks. Well, that was not a pleasant experience. So we didn't do that. But so during that period, there was no inspections taking place. I mean, that's the reality. And even
Yeah.
now in good times, we don't have the ability to, project that kind of supervision, right?
Well,
So
I
that's
think
the other
one of the
global problem is the
I think
FDA.
I think one of your upcoming guests, David Sanders, who's going to be on an episode here in the near future, I think a couple episodes from now, he is the expert on this. We've talked to David about it before, and he feels this pain all day, every day when when he is got a innovative drug ready to save lives, but somebody won't go inspect some small process at the factory. Uh, it, you're relying upon almost admin at that point. It's not to go inspect uh, if the manufacturing works. It's going to inspect that they're sterilizing it right, or they do there are different processes in the manufacturing process. And so I think David will shine some light on that. And I'm sure you guys are going to have a good conversation
Yeah.
about it.
David is really the founder and leader of a thing called samscoalition.org, which is securing America's medicine supply. He's really a leader in the area of this sort of redomestication of the medical supply chain. I mean, he's a wealth of knowledge. He'll be a fantastic guest. We love David, and he's a great partner. He's somebody that really cares about the country and his experience firsthand. I know with his family, for example, the unfortunate impact of supply chain problems and healthcare outcomes. So, yeah, he'll be a great addition to this conversation. The other thing that I wanted to, while we're on this FDA, the supervision and inspection discussion, is there are quality problems. And, that's the other part of this. And we saw this again is another one of these ongoing problems. This isn't like, oh, it was bad, a couple of years ago. But this is another thing that is just ongoing. And we saw this just a couple of weeks ago. There was a eye drop from India that came in, and it was contaminated basically. It was causing people to have eye problems, go blind because the drug, it's one of those, the thing that's supposed to help me is the thing that's killing me type of outcome. And once again, it's just because we don't have good supply, supervision in other countries.
How
And
could
then
we? How
yeah.
could you? It's just too complicated. It's too big. You couldn't have proper supervision.
Well, in India is even more difficult because one thing about China is it's one language, one government, top down control. When the guy at the top of the Chinese Communist Party says, do exit that factory, it happens. When they say, seize 40% of that inventory at iRemedy, the factory chairman knew about it and there's nothing he could do. He's like, yeah, we got to be ready. The CCP's coming in. Like wasn't even a discussion. So in their in those kind of activities, they're actually good at what they do. Like they're a well-run, you know, uh, organized country. Whereas India, and not taking anything away from them, there's a lot of great talented people there and great companies in India, but their society is different, right? They have a lot of local governments, and then I don't know what you call those states or
States, yeah,
provinces.
states.
Yeah,
I think there's 27 states and 27 languages. So
27 languages and 27 different regulatory environments. And it's not unusual for one state to not be able to communicate with the other state due to language barrier problems. It's
yeah,
not like, you know, a guy with a southern drawl in Alabama speaking
It's
to a New
yeah, it's not
Yorker.
an
It's
accent.
a
It's
it,
it's not an
yeah,
accent or a dialect. It's a full on other language.
right,
My
right,
fiance would tell me about stories growing up there where she would have interactions with shopkeepers and not be able to speak their language, even though she was, from the next state over and they're visiting on a holiday or a field trip or
yeah,
whatever the case was.
yeah. It's just another variable when you go back to realizing that your life is dependent upon that system. That's the remarkable thing. And as the point you made at the beginning of the podcast, it's not about buying a pair of sunglasses or a jacket, that's made in China. It's about a life and death item. And we think drugs, we think gloves, but I get into things like scalpels, medical implants, medical devices, blood pressure machines, IV drips,
Oh,
robotics. I mean,
vitamins. Go take a look
vitamins.
at your vitamins tonight when you
Yeah.
take your vitamins. Look on the back of that bottle. It's going to say most likely made in China or made with foreign parts.
Yes.
That's a whole separate
Dude,
conversation. You get into that with
right.
David. The labeling of made in America.
Yeah. When it might say made in America, it just means final assembly,
Yeah,
kind of, right? But
it's a.
it's almost
I read
unthinkable.
about it the other day. It's foreign domestic product. So it's domestically assembled or domestically manufactured, but that means they just put foreign pills into a bottle, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, the
Uh,
bottle is made in America. Well, the
well,
label is put on the bottle. The bottle's not
yeah,
made in America.
an
Nor
American
probably
touched
is
it.
the label.
No,
The label is put onto the bottle in
in
America, and the
America.
pills are
Yeah,
put into the bottle in America. But the pills, the label, and the bottle all came from somewhere else.
yeah.
Is
Bottle
is
definitely didn't come from America. We don't produce any plastic here in America,
yeah,
unfortunately. So
yeah.
that's one thing, American Nitro. I'm sure we'll have them on at some point, but they're up against that as well. Even though they're a sophisticated, patented, innovative glove manufacturer in Ohio with substantial capital, like these are the real deal. They're not a flash in the pan COVID manufacturer. They're the real deal. They can't procure their raw materials here in the U.S. That doesn't exist. They have to go to Brazil or they have to go to the Congo or wherever the nitrile rubber is produced.
Mm-hmm.
They're dependent upon the next layer above the supply chain. But again, it's not all doom and gloom. There are steps taking place to reshore manufacturing, and there are things happening now more so than ever. And you just got to solve one problem at a time. You can't solve the whole system at a time. It's one problem, one product, one step at a time. But it is a generational change or a generational shift. It's not going to happen in 10 years.
Absolutely. Just kind of, we need to wrap up. We're going to run out of time here. I just want to, kind of, wrap a little bit on, we did in the end deliver the needles, and it was about 150 aircraft, 1,000 semi trucks full. I tell people it's kind of like filling and emptying a Costco every week for about 9 months. It was just an amazing logistics, manufacturing, and delivery process that involved a lot of partners, and in the end China manufactured and got it done. But it is, and our book gets into this, but it was like the war dogs of medical supply. There was bribes being done by other countries trying to buy our supply. There was extortion, there was stealing, there was government interference, and certain,
Impersonations.
there were people impersonating people. It was just every crazy thing in the world. And that's what I think really got my attention is when I observed that, I thought, oh my gosh, and we are dependent on this system. It's just, that's what kind of scared us and got our attention about, writing the book and really committing iRemedy to being somebody that helps solve this problem. So one, our AI technology learns, and we really in the end hope to become the definitive authoritative source of information about the supply chain globally. And then secondly, like we're talking about American Nitro, but a lot of other great companies, and we'll have a lot of these guys on in the podcast, are starting companies either in America, maybe in Mexico, United States or Mexico, Canada, other places in the Americas, so they can truck here on our time zone. Other friendly countries, Israel, Australia, the EU. But that's all happening, and we at iRemedy are going to be a go-to-market solution for them. So we're really, already I think we're well known within the U.S. government as a company that promotes the Made in America, brand, if you will, and that's a big part of our commitment and a reason that we're so passionate on the subject. So, that's kind of my comments, Anthony. I don't know if you have anything that you want to wrap up with, but I think it's a great conversation. I really enjoyed getting into it.
Yeah, we could go on for hours about it. I'm sure we'll talk more at some point on the supply side and get into some more details. And it's there's iRemedy is unique in that we are not an allocation based system. We find products in shortage. We have direct manufacturer relationships all around the world. We can solve the hard, complex supply chain problems that the procurement person at that practice faces every single day. That's what sets us apart. That's our differentiator in the market, and we're up against, of course, the big guys in the space, 100-year-old companies that are bigger than Amazon. And we're a small, you know, startup company with very powerful technology that allows us to be as efficient, if not more efficient, than those companies. So for us, this is what we do all day, every day, and it was natural for us to step up and help during the pandemic. But you almost have to take a step back at times and look at the problem as a whole. Look at the whole macro globalization problem that we face every day, and analyze how we got here and analyze how we could at least take steps towards improving it in the future.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that's a good time and a good chat. And with that, that's a wrap for today's trip down the medical supply lane. I am Tony Paquin. It's been a pleasure guiding everybody on this journey. Join us again and in the upcoming weeks for more supply chain sleuthing on the supply side. We have a big challenge and a big mountain to climb, and we really need your help. So support us. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this podcast if you enjoyed our discussion. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and hey, let's keep this conversation going. Thanks, everybody.